The courtroom was packed that Tuesday morning in Austin, Texas. Judge Robert Whitmore, known for his stern demeanor and little patience for cases he considered trivial, adjusted his glasses as he reviewed the day's hearing schedule. At 52, he had built a reputation for efficiency in the Travis County judicial system, handling each case with calculated speed and little tolerance for unnecessary drama. The next case involved a property dispute between neighbors, something Whitmore considered a waste of the court's time. He sighed audibly as the clerk announced the names of those involved. On one side was Harold Peterson, a 63-year-old retired businessman complaining about property boundaries. On the other side was Martha Reeves, a 78-year-old woman who had lived on the same street for over 50 years. Martha entered the courtroom with slow but determined steps, wearing a modest floral dress and carrying a worn leather purse. Her gray hair was tied, back in a simple bun, and her clear blue eyes observed everything with a quiet attention that many might mistake for senile frailty. Whitmore barely glanced at her as he leafed through the case documents. Harold Peterson was accompanied by his lawyer, a young and ambitious man named Derek Chambers, who immediately began presenting the case with rehearsed eloquence. He spoke about land measurements, deed documents, and violations of private property. Whitmore listened with a bored expression, occasionally making notes without much interest. When it was Martha's turn to speak, she slowly rose from her chair. The judge barely suppressed a sigh of impatience. Harold Peterson whispered something to his lawyer, and both smiled discreetly, clearly underestimating the elderly woman before them. Whitmore tapped his pen on the table and asked in a monotone if she had legal representation. Martha replied calmly that she would speak for herself. Whitmore rolled his eyes almost imperceptibly, clearly prepared to end this quickly. He asked what exactly her defense was against Peterson's allegations about the fences and property boundaries she supposedly violated when planting her rose bushes. That's when Martha opened her old purse and pulled out an envelope yellowed with age. She explained that before answering about fences and rose bushes, she needed to clarify something about her identity that might help the court understand the context of the situation. Whitmore made an impatient gesture with her hand, saying she didn't have time for life stories and that she should focus on the facts of the case. Martha politely ignored the interruption and continued. She mentioned that during the Vietnam War, she had served in the United States Armed Forces in a capacity that was highly classified at the time. Whitmore let out a short, sarcastic laugh, commenting that many people claimed to have impressive military histories when facing legal proceedings. The judge turned to the clerk and made a comment loud enough for everyone to hear, saying that the next thing she'd say would be that she had a secret code name and had saved the world. Some people in the gallery laughed nervously. Harold Peterson was visibly pleased with how the hearing was going. Martha remained impassive. She simply opened the envelope and took out several documents, extending them toward the judge. Whitmore took the papers with exaggerated reluctance, still with a condescending smile on his face. He began to quickly examine the documents, clearly expecting to find something unimportant. The first document was a military service order dated 1968. Whitmore continued flipping through it, his smile beginning to falter slightly. There were training certificates, letters of command, and mission documents with official Department of Defense seals. The judge stopped smiling completely when he found a specific page. His eyes widened slightly as he reread the document several times. The room fell silent, noticing the sudden change in his expression. Martha remained standing patiently, her hands clasped in front of her, watching the judge process the information he had just discovered. Whitmore looked up from the documents and gazed at Martha with a completely different expression. The condescension had vanished, replaced by something between shock and disbelief. He asked, in a suddenly respectful voice, if that information was indeed accurate. Martha simply nodded affirmatively. The document that had caught the judge's attention was a military service record, identifying Martha Reeves as a radio operator who had served on high-risk communications missions during the Vietnam War. But that wasn't all. The document listed her operational call sign used during classified missions. Her call sign was Red River. The name was not random. Martha had been one of the few women recruited for a special military communications program that coordinated rescue operations and reconnaissance missions in hostile territory. Red River was a call sign that became legendary among veterans of a specific era of the war. Whitmore had read about Red River years earlier in a book about classified military operations that had been declassified decades later. The operator behind that call sign had been responsible for coordinating communications that saved countless American soldiers' lives, keeping lines of communication open under enemy fire and in impossible conditions. The judge placed the documents on the table slowly, his hand trembling slightly. He apologized to Martha directly and sincerely, acknowledging that he had judged the situation completely inappropriately. The change in his demeanor was so dramatic that the entire courtroom fell into absolute silence. Harold Peterson and his lawyer exchanged confused glances, not fully understanding what had just happened. Derek Chambers tried to resume his line of argument about the property violations, but Whitmore interrupted him with a firm gesture of her hand, telling him to remain silent while Mrs. Reeves finished presenting her side of the story. Martha then explained, in a clear and firm voice, that the rose bushes Peterson claimed were encroaching on his property were actually planted within the correct boundaries of his own land. She had lived in that house since 1972, when she returned from military service. She knew every inch of that property. She presented original deed documents, professional land surveys conducted when she purchased the house, and even old photographs that clearly showed where the property markers had always been. Peterson had bought his house only 5 years prior, and was attempting to claim part of Martha's garden based on incorrect measurements. Martha went on to explain that she had tried to resolve the situation amicably with Peterson multiple times. She had shown him the original property documents, offered to pay for a new professional search, and even suggested that they both share the costs of a proper fence on the correct boundaries. Peterson had refused all offers and insisted on suing her. What Peterson didn't know was that Martha had worked after her military retirement as a file clerk for the county records office for 15 years. She understood property documentation better than most real estate lawyers. She had brought not only her own documents, but also the complete historical records of every property on that street since the 1950s. Martha presented a detailed map. She had prepared herself, showing the evolution of property divisions over the decades. She pointed out where Peterson had made his mistake. He was using as a reference a decorative fence that a previous owner had incorrectly installed in the 1980s, not the actual officially registered property boundaries. Whitmore examined each document Martha presented with a meticulous attention he hadn't shown at the beginning of the hearing. He asked specific questions about dates, measurements, and legal references. Martha answered each question with calm precision, citing document numbers and registration codes from memory. Derek Chambers attempted to dispute some of Martha's documents, but it quickly became clear that he hadn't done his homework properly. Whitmore pointed out several inconsistencies in Peterson's case, including the fact that the measurements he had submitted were taken by a company that wasn't properly licensed in the state of Texas. Harold Peterson began to grow visibly uncomfortable in his chair. He whispered something urgent to his lawyer, who seemed equally disturbed by the turn of events. Whitmore asked Peterson directly why he hadn't accepted Martha's reasonable offers to settle the dispute out of court. Peterson stammered a response about principles and property rights, but his previous confidence had completely evaporated. Whitmore observed that the court did not appreciate people who wasted judicial resources on frivolous cases that could have been resolved through basic communication between neighbors. The judge then did something unexpected. He asked Martha for permission to briefly share with the court the meaning of the call sign, Red River. Martha hesitated for a moment, then agreed with a discreet nod. Whitmore explained, in a respectful voice, that Red River was a legendary call sign associated with operations that had changed the course of specific battles during the war. He mentioned, without going into classified details, that radio operators like Martha were frequently priority enemy targets because their elimination would cut vital communications between military units. They operated under constant risk of death, often in forward positions where any mistake could cost not only their lives, but the lives of everyone who depended on those communications. The courtroom fell completely silent as Whitmore spoke. He explained that after researching Red River further years ago, he had discovered that this particular operator had maintained open communications during a rescue operation that saved 37 American soldiers who were surrounded in hostile territory, holding their position even when their own location was under direct attack. Martha remained quiet throughout the explanation, her face showing little emotion, but her eyes revealed memories of times she clearly preferred not to revisit. When Whitmore finished, he looked directly at Peterson and said that this woman had risked her life for his country, and he had responded by suing her over rose bushes. Whitmore then delivered his decision. He not only dismissed Peterson's case entirely, but also ordered him to pay all of Martha's legal costs, including any time she had lost preparing her defense. He also ordered Peterson to pay for a new professional survey of both properties, conducted by a licensed and mutually agreed-upon firm. Furthermore, Whitmore formally warned Peterson against filing frivolous lawsuits and strongly suggested that he offer a formal apology to his neighbor. The judge made it clear that if Peterson continued to harass Martha over property matters, he would consider restraining orders and potential harassment charges. Derek Chambers tried to object to the severity of the decision, but Whitmore interrupted him again, this time with clear irritation in his voice. He said the lawyer should have better advised his client and conducted a proper investigation before bringing such a flimsy case to court. The reprimand was severe enough to leave Chambers visibly embarrassed. When the hearing ended, Martha calmly gathered her documents and placed them back in her old bag. Several people in the gallery approached her as she left, some thanking her for her service, others simply wanting to shake her hand. Martha accepted the attention with modest grace, clearly uncomfortable with the recognition. Whitmore asked to speak briefly with Martha in his office before she left the courtroom. Once in private, he apologized, again, this time more personally, for his initial attitude. He explained that he had developed a cynicism about the system over the years that sometimes caused him to judge situations hastily. Martha accepted the apology gracefully, saying she understood that judges dealt with dozens of cases every day and that it was natural to develop certain expectations. She held no grudge. Whitmore said that the experience had been an important reminder that one should never judge people by their appearance or make assumptions about their stories. In the days following the hearing, the story spread rapidly through the local legal community. Whitmore discovered that several other judges and lawyers knew the Red River legend, and many were impressed to learn that this legendary operator was living quietly in Austin. The story eventually reached the local media. A small community newspaper published an article about Martha and her military service, with her permission. The article led to several veterans organizations contacting her, inviting her to speak at events and recognition ceremonies. Martha accepted some invitations, but maintained her preference for a quiet life. Harold Peterson eventually followed the judge's suggestion and offered a formal apology to Martha. He admitted that he had been stubborn, and that he should have listened to her explanations from the beginning. New professional research confirmed exactly what Martha had said. The rose bushes were completely within her property, and Peterson had been wrong all along. Martha continued living in her house, tending to her garden and the rose bushes that had caused all that commotion. She never spoke much about her days as Red River, except when veterans specifically sought her out. For her, it was part of a distant past, a duty she had fulfilled when her country needed her. Whitmore never forgot that day in court. He kept a framed photograph in his office, not of Martha specifically, but of a group of Vietnam-era military radio operators he had found in his research files. The image served as a constant reminder never to underestimate people based on superficial appearances or hasty assumptions about who they were or what they had accomplished in their lives. In the months following the trial, Martha's life gradually returned to the tranquil rhythm she had always preferred. The rose bushes that had been the center of the dispute bloomed profusely that spring, their vibrant red petals becoming a kind of unintentional symbol in the neighborhood. People walking down the street often stopped to admire the garden, and some neighbors who had never spoken to Martha began to greet her with genuine respect. Harold Peterson maintained a respectful distance after the incident. He had learned a costly lesson about pride and hasty assumptions. Occasionally, Martha would see him working in his own garden, and they would exchange cordial nods through the fence that was now positioned exactly where it should. Always have been. Their relationship never became friendly, but they achieved a respectful peace that was sufficient for both of them. Judge Whitmore underwent his own personal transformation after that day. He began to approach each case with renewed attention to detail and fewer assumptions about the people appearing before him. His colleagues noticed the change, commenting that he seemed more patient and thoughtful during hearings. Whitmore never specifically mentioned Martha's case as a catalyst, but those close to him perceived the connection. He also began researching more deeply into veterans living in the local community. Whitmore discovered that there were dozens of people with extraordinary service stories living ordinary, unassuming lives in Austin. Some had served in wars, others on humanitarian missions, and many had simply dedicated years of their lives to public service in ways that rarely received recognition. Martha received a special invitation from the American Legion to be a guest speaker at a Veterans Day ceremony. She initially hesitated, never having been comfortable being the center of attention, but eventually agreed. Her speech was brief and modest, focusing not on her own accomplishments, but on the importance of recognizing the silent sacrifices of all who served. During that event, Martha reunited with several veterans who had served at the same time as her. Some knew the legend of Red River only from stories, while others had been on missions where their communications made the difference between life and death. The reunions were emotional, filled with hugs and tears from people sharing memories of a time that had profoundly shaped their lives. One veteran in particular, a man named James Mitchell, who was now 75 years old, approached Martha with tears in his eyes. He explained that he had been among the 37 soldiers rescued in that operation that Whitmore had briefly mentioned in court. Mitchell said that he had spent 50 years wanting to thank the person behind that call sign, and now he finally had his chance. Martha embraced Mitchell as he openly wept, repeatedly thanking God for his life. She gently said she was just doing her job, just as he was doing his. For Martha, that moment encapsulated why she rarely spoke about her military service. The memories were too intense, laden with emotional weight she had spent decades processing. Derek Chambers, Peterson's lawyer, also underwent deep reflection after the case. He had begun his career with the ambition of building a reputation quickly, sometimes accepting cases without proper investigation if clients paid well. The public embarrassment in court forced him to reassess his approach. Chambers became more selective about which cases he accepted and began conducting much more thorough investigations before entering any courtroom. Martha's story eventually reached a documentary production company that was working on a project about female veterans whose contributions had been neglected by history. They contacted Martha asking to include her in the documentary. After much consideration, she agreed to give an interview, but only on the condition that the focus be on the collective experiences of the women who served, not just her individual story. The documentary, when it was finally released, brought renewed attention to the contributions of women in the armed forces during the Vietnam War. Martha appeared in only one segment, but her story resonated deeply with audiences. She received hundreds of letters from people thanking her for her service and sharing their own stories of family members who had served. Whitmore watched the documentary at home with his wife, who was equally impressed by Martha's story. He felt a mixture of pride at having had the chance to rectify his initial mistake and renewed shame for almost having treated that extraordinary woman with disrespect. The experience solidified his determination to always look beyond superficial appearances. Martha continued her quiet routine, tending to her garden, occasionally attending veterans' events when invited, and keeping in touch with some of the veterans she had reconnected with. She never sought recognition or fame, content with the quiet satisfaction of having served honorably when called upon and having lived a meaningful life ever since. The red rose bushes in her garden bloomed every year, a visual reminder to everyone in the neighborhood of the importance of truly knowing people before judging them. The lesson Martha had unwittingly taught in that courtroom resonated far beyond that room, touching lives and changing perspectives in ways she could never have imagined.